Hi, in this video I'm going to talk about how we made a first-person shooter in Unreal Engine in 1 week for a Breakers game jam. We were a team of 8 people, but as often happens, everyone had a different amount of time they could contribute. The jam's theme was "Nothing Can Go Wrong." I took it as a kind of crisis management, like running a restaurant where appliances start breaking down and you have to fix things on the fly. My wife suggested a space station setting where malfunctions began happening, inspired by 2001 Space Odyssey. One of the artists mentioned aliens and someone else brought up gremlins. With all those ideas floating around, I came up with our first concept. The idea was to make a first-person game when you play as a worker on a small spaceship. It starts with you trying to feed an alien creature despite the ship's AI warning you not to. You ignore it with a classic "come on, what could go wrong?" and of course the creature escapes and chaos begins. From there the ship starts to break down. Lights flickering go out, doors get stuck, gravity generator might fail, and so on. The core gameplay loop revolved around responding to these malfunctions. Something would go wrong on the ship and you would have to travel from point A to point B to fix it. I really like this concept because it was very scalable. I think the best game concepts are what I call onions. You start with a small simple core idea that works on its own and still has some originality. Then you layer on additional complexity as time and resources allow. This approach helps you set clear priorities and makes it easier to scale back when time runs out. We could start with a simple version, just a basic traversal and a timer, and then add more mechanics depending on how much time we had left. Things like evil creatures, weapons, or different type of malfunctions could be all layered in later. But as often happens, ideas evolved once we shared them with the team. The feature that stood out to everyone was the cute alien creature you had to take care of, kind of like a Tamagotchi. So the focus shifted from fixing the ship to keeping the creature in a stable condition. We also gathered some images from movies and games to create a mood board and establish the visual style we were aiming for. Once we agreed on the concept and overall tone of the game, I could start working on the music. I like to begin with music because for sound effects I usually need more details about what's actually going to be implemented in the game. While synths might seem like the obvious choice for a sci-fi setting, I feel more comfortable working with orchestral instruments, so I decided to take a more retro approach, drawing inspiration from soundtracks of Gremlins and Critters. The music gravitates around the pedal tone. I wanted something closer to ambient music without a strict pulse or tempo. So although there is a main motif, most of the track consists of variations and smaller musical ideas that orbit around the tonal center. If we had more time, I'd render these phrases as separate elements and make a more procedural or adapted music track from that. But given the limitation, I just made one long loop from that. While I was working on the music, the rest of the team started building the game in the engine. They began by blocking out the level, starting with a simple top-down floor plan sketch, then building walls directly on top of it using the drawing as a temporary textures. This might be standard practice for level designers, but I was amazed how quickly we had a rough version of the level. They also started developing the AI for our cute creature Ziggy. Before we had a custom model, we used a pre-made asset as a placeholder. This really helped speed up development and testing. At the same time, we made several 2D concept art for Ziggy. We picked one and began modeling it. Our environment artist worked full-time on the project and created all the assets for the game world entirely from scratch. Once I had the first draft of the music, I could start working on the sound effects. I began by building the ambience to have some context for other sounds. I used some recorded samples and even the sound of the construction work happening under my window. This was my first time working with meta sounds, so I wasn't sure how to set up a dynamic ambient mix properly. Instead, I decided to create 3 different ambient layers and play them in different areas on the game map. That way, the mix would naturally shift depending on where the player was standing. For the rest of the sounds, it's best practice to create an asset list with all sounds you'll need in the game. This helps you estimate the workload and track which sounds are finished or still missing, and keep notes about how certain sounds should behave. The tricky part is that during the early development you don't know exactly what sounds you'll need. Sometimes you even end up creating assets for features that never get implemented because their programmers run out of time. So the asset list often changes, but even a rough plan is better than no plan at all. The most important thing is to set priorities here. You need to know which sounds must be done first and which ones have the biggest impact on gameplay. For example, footsteps are basic and always needed, but things like weapon sounds and creature effects add more to the game's personality. I usually start by events that are already implemented in the game. I prefer to implement sounds as early as possible, as soon as I have a complete set of sounds for a particular system, like a single character. Waiting until the last day to ask programmers to implement all sounds is definitely not a good idea. By that point they'll likely be swamped with other, often more critical tasks, and there won't be enough time to test or fix issues like balancing the volume or correcting playback bugs. It's also harder to make last-minute changes because of how version control systems works. In Unreal Engine it's not ideal for 2 people to edit the same blueprint class at the same time. If you want to change a blueprint, you need to make sure no one else is editing it at the moment. For Ziggy's sounds, my main reference was this scene from the Gremlins movie.
Great, thanks a lot. Sorry. Who's in that jar?
I use a combination of different animal recordings, like monkeys, rodents and similar creatures, and layered them with effects. However, if we wanted Ziggy to express a wider range of emotions, I'd probably need to use some voice acting. It's difficult to get enough variety and emotions from the library sounds while still keeping everything consistent and feeling like it's coming from the same character. That's why when I did some research, I found out that both Gizmo and Stitch were actually voiced by actors making silly voices and not created from animal sounds like the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park.
I did this movie called Gremlins.
You were
I'm
Gizmo. Yes.
The first
Yeah.
little one, but it's the same voice. He goes, it's the same voice. So this
For weapons, I mostly use synthesized sounds, though I used some audio samples for a fire extinguisher. As often happens, as the deadline approached, we had to admit we couldn't implement everything we had planned, so we needed to scope down. We had to make the level smaller than it was in the blockout phase, abandon some planned mechanics and so on. We also didn't have enough time to create a unique model for the evil version of Ziggy, so we just changed its color scheme and size to make it feel different. We started aggressively scoping down too late, so we only got a playable level near the end of the jam. That left us with very little time for playtesting, and more importantly, not enough time to fix the issues that came up during that stage. The most critical problem was performance. Ironically, it turned out that the decision to reuse the same model for the evil Ziggy was a big part of the issue. You see, the Ziggy model has a lot of fur, and simulating that fur takes a lot of resources. So when you spawn multiple versions of him, performance drops quickly. If we had created a separate model for the evil twins, something more lizard-like as originally imagined, we probably wouldn't have so many problems. Luckily, with Break This Game Jam you get a little extra time after the submission deadline to fix the bugs, So we disabled the first simulation, which helped a lot with performance and made the game more playable, but still there are a few bugs left in the final version. After we released the game, the next challenge was convincing people to actually play it. And that's not so easy, since our game couldn't be played in a browser and had a huge download size of almost 800 megabytes. That might not sound like a lot, but when you're competing with games that can be played instantly with just a click, it becomes a major hurdle. So I had to take some extra steps to improve our chances. I made a trailer for the game, took some good screenshots, and we tried to make our game page as polished and inviting as possible. Still, we definitely got less feedback that I usually see, even though I was actively playing and commenting on other people's games myself. So here are my takeaways. The first one is scope down. It might seem obvious, but whether you're a beginner or more experienced developer, it's easy to overestimate how much you can get done and underestimate how long it will take. And even if you get it right, the chances are that the rest of the team won't, especially if you're working with new people. So it's always safer to start from something small and build on top of that. Next one is get a playable prototype as soon as possible. And I don't just mean implementing a single mechanic, it should be something that already gives you an idea how the game would feel. You can use simple shapes or third-party assets as temporary placeholders, but a lot of design decisions can only be made once you can actually try it. Next, leave some time for testing and fixing the bugs. You can spend all your time adding features, but if there's no time left for testing, those features might break the game instead of improving it. And last one, Unreal might be overkill for a game jam. This might be a bit controversial, but while I enjoyed using Unreal, it felt like overkill for a 1 week jam. Maybe I'll feel differently later, but for now I'd prefer go with something lighter or at least make sure to optimize the build size properly. Of course, there were things on the other side I wish I'd done better, like making more music and making it more adaptive, but the thing that bothered me the most was not implementing the occlusion. Occlusion is when sounds behave differently depending on obstacles, like muffling sounds behind a closed door. In our game you hear everything the same way whether the door is open or closed, and that really breaks immersion for me. So yeah, that's kind of it. I hope you found this helpful and maybe learned something from our mistakes. So thanks for watching and see you next time.